Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this afternoon session, which is entitled Ask the Experts, a Biomedical Innovation Forum. My name is Brad Martin, and I am the Executive Director for Fast Forward Medical Innovation at the University of Michigan. And this program is part of the ever-expanding educational offerings from our education group at Fast Forward. Today's presentation is presented in partnership with the Economic Development Administration of the United States and through a grant that we received, an I-6 grant that we received from the EDA, with the goal of accelerating the economic impact and the ecosystem here in Southeast Michigan and across the state for life sciences and biomedical innovation. Today's session is really going to be in two parts. The first part will be a panel discussion where we have the pleasure of having a number of investors from across the state who will give you a peek into their mindset and what they look at when they're evaluating particularly academic technologies coming out of universities, to give you some insight into what they're thinking about, what the process looks like, and what you could expect if you were to be involved in starting a company and having an investor, a financial investor, come in as part of that development process. The second part of the afternoon will be a poster presentation where we have asked for posters from across the state of Michigan. We've asked tech transfer offices from across the state to submit one poster from their institution, which is really on the cusp of what they hope is a commercial pathway. And we're going to have sort of a moderated poster session where our panelists will be going through and giving their input on the technology, what the next steps may be. It's going to be very important, I think, for the inventors, the technologies themselves, as well as for the audience. The audience is going to get a peek into what that process may look like and what's really important for an investor when they look at a technology like these. So I hope it's an informative afternoon for all of you. I appreciate you joining us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Master of Ceremonies for the day, Rich Chilla. Rich is the Executive Director for MSU Technologies. Longtime friend of Fast Forward in the Michigan biomedical ecosystem. So, Rich, so glad you could join us here, and I'll turn it over to you for the rest of the afternoon.
Well, thanks very much, Brad, and it's my pleasure to join. And thanks you very much for the invitation to moderate. As Brad said, a friend of Fast Forward Medical Innovation. I've been at Michigan State University, heading up the tech transfer office for about the past 9 years. But before that, I had the pleasure of working at University of Michigan with Brad and other colleagues, and so enjoyed my time very much there. So been roughly the last 12, 13 years in university innovation. But before that, I spent my first 20 years in industry, primarily the chemical industry. I'm actually an engineer by training. So with that, can I advance the next slide, please? So as I said, I'm going to welcome our panelists soon. We'll have a panel discussion with some Q&A. So for those of you who are on the call, I would invite you to, as the panel, as we're going through the discussion, if you have particular questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom to type your questions in, and we'll try to have this. We'll try to do it in real time and have the questions as we go along rather than waiting at the end. We will, of course, have a period at the end as well, but just so everyone is aware. Thank you very much. And I think that's it with the slides. Very good. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel. We have three terrific investors with us today. We have Dan Keitel of Arboretum Ventures, Hirak Parikh from Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund, and Mike Devries from Wakestream Ventures. So welcome all. I'm going to call on you one at a time, just ask you to introduce yourselves a little bit. So with that, Dan, can you introduce us to Arboretum Ventures and tell us a little bit about your fund, please?
Yep. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining today. My name is Dan Keitel. I'm a partner with Arboretum Ventures. We're a healthcare-focused venture fund based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Have been around since about 2003. and manage a total of about $700 million in capital spread across 5 funds. We invest broadly across healthcare and life sciences, really with the exception of biopharma. So if you look at the 50 to 60 investments we've made, about half of those have been medical devices or diagnostic technologies that have an FDA pathway. And the other half has included healthcare IT, healthcare services, and life science tools. I have been with the firm for the past 10 years, primarily focused on tools and diagnostics, and I'm a double Wolverine, both undergrad and grad school at University of Michigan.
Thanks very much, Dan, and thanks for joining our panel today. We appreciate it. And Hirak, maybe you can introduce yourself and Michigan Biomed Venture Fund.
Hi, I'm Hirak Parikh. Until a couple of weeks ago, I used to run the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund. Now I'm no longer there, but I was at the fund about 5 years, a little over 5 years. And the focus of the fund was looking at early stage startups at the University of Michigan in the life sciences. So we invested through the fund in 12 companies so far in the last 5 years. And they range from pharmaceuticals, medtech, healthcare IT, diagnostics, pretty much any life science focus. Much of my experience has been looking at a lot of inventions and companies that are started by graduate students, maybe faculty that we have funded, and usually we are the first capital in. And the intention of the fund is to sort of be a bridge between a company that's formed out of university IP and then bridging that to someone like Dan, who is sitting at the Arboretum end, which will probably make more like Series A, Series B, larger investments. So the goal from the fund is to provide feedback using folks on our investment advisory board, kind of give them sort of the feedback that they would get, were they pitching this at, say, a venture firm. In the last couple of weeks, I've joined Johnson & Johnson's venture arm. It's called JJDC. So I'll be investing for them from a strategic corporate venture perspective. But obviously for the talk today, we kind of focus on the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund. And a brief background about me: I got my PhD at Michigan in biomedical engineering. Did a bunch of startups and then came back to run the fund. And now I'm moving to Boston. But thank you for the invite and happy to be on the panel.
Thanks very much, Hirak. We're glad to have you here. And Mike, you want to talk a little bit about Wakestream Ventures and yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Rich. And thanks, everybody, for joining us today. I'm Mike Devries. I'm managing director at Wakestream Ventures. Wakestream's really a offshoot of a family office here over in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So we don't have traditional capital like what you would hear from Dan or Hirak. We invest on behalf of a family, and we invest on an allocation basis on an annual basis. So I can't really report on size of the fund. I can't really report on numbers of that nature, but we put probably 5 to 10 million annually out into new deals. And we're a broad range investor, so we're more generalists than we are focused exclusively in healthcare. That said, my whole career has been focused in the healthcare space. So for my earliest days, I've been involved in the medical device space, both on a operating background and then on an investing background. Prior to this, I was with a firm called EDF Ventures with my partner, Mary Campbell. We did a fair number of deals that were spun out of universities, predominantly Big Ten universities. We did several out of Michigan, a few out of Michigan State, Purdue, Indiana. I'm forgetting some, but those were the dominant tech transfer groups that we worked with over the years. So I've had a fair amount of experience in terms of helping identify opportunities inside of universities and helping marry those opportunities with either capital and or talent, business talent. So looking forward to answering any questions. And like I said, focus is more business or more med device than it is therapeutic or biotech, but we venture into that space once in a while. I'll try to sound like I know what I'm talking about. So.
Thanks very much, Mike. And thanks again to all the panelists. I thought I would actually start a little bit from since we have a lot of faculty academics on the call. I thought I'd start a little bit with what I perceive to be the top 10, if you will, active research areas in biomedical innovation. And I'd be interested in contrasting those to see if those are the areas that are hot investable areas. It'd be interesting to see if there is direct overlap, or if some things in the research area are not popular in the innovation area. And if there's popular innovation areas that aren't maybe as active research. So as I look at the top 10 areas for biomedical research right now, I'm just going to kind of tick through them. It's tissue engineering, transdermal patches, wearable devices, robotic surgeons, nanorobots, virtual reality in many different forms, microbubbles, small bubbles being used to carry drugs to areas where the bubbles can be burst upon with ultrasound or some other type of external source. Prime editing, sort of CRISPR adapted for humans. Organ on a chip and mini bioreactors. So as I look at the space, this is what this is where a lot of the research articles are, but I'm kind of curious as to how that lines up with your experience in investing in the space. Maybe, Mike, I'll start with you if you don't mind. Interested in your perspective on that list.
Yeah, so I wouldn't argue with any of those. I think those are all areas that we've either seen technology and being less involved in the academic world now than I was, we see them when they're more of a form deal than they are, raw technology. So,
right.
But the real differentiator, I think, in all of those is that there's actually a clinical problem being addressed and not simply a wow factor. This is really cool, but I'm not improving patient care in any way, shape, or form just because I've got a robotic surgeon, for instance. I think,
right.
Yeah, my earliest days, I was involved with Intuitive when I was at a company called Medtronic, and Intuitive Surgical today is a pretty successful company. But back in those days, they were trying to tie knots in coronary artery bypass grafts. And the robot couldn't do it as well as a surgeon. They were trying to force it. And, at the end of the day, it came through by identifying areas that the technology actually could make a difference in. And I think all of those technologies you mentioned, Rich, are going to have to prove that they actually can make life better for the patient and the physician.
Yeah, I think you raised a really interesting point, Mike, is that, and I think it's going to be a theme that comes through today, is this whole idea about there being market pull for this, not just a technology push. Dan, what's your perspective on the list in the area that I went through? How does that line up with what you guys see and what you guys invest in?
Yeah, I would echo some of Mike's comments, and obviously given the stage that our firm invests, where we're doing, as you mentioned, Series A or B financings, typically the sort of early stage research, we're a couple of years out ahead. I think the component that I would add as a thread that runs through pretty much everything we're taking interest in now is just really thinking about the value to the system. And it's, Mike talked about, is this really addressing a clinical need where there's a gap in care, but also just the health economic lens of, ultimately the system is going to have to pay for this technology, and what's the case for them doing that? Is it, significantly improved outcome, avoidance of costly care down the road, or a bad outcome? And I think particularly in the med device space, if you rewound, 6 or 7 years ago, FDA risk would have been the thing that we were primarily focused on. Now the reimbursement risk and establishing payment for novel technologies, I think, sort of dwarfs any sort of regulatory risk. It's much more predictable on that side. So I think advice for researchers in any of those fields would just be think ahead about what is the ultimate value proposition that you're bringing to the market and how it's going to get paid for ultimately.
That's great perspective, Dan. And Hirak, from your side, what did you? How did that list line up to things that you saw when you were at Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund?
Yeah, our focus is a little bit different because we are actually agnostic to what the area is. What we are trying to do is we're trying to figure out, is this going to be a sustainable business? One of the things that so my advice to researchers is that whatever you're working on, you're experts in that. I would sort of work backwards from stuff that Mike and Dan said and kind of see how that tallies with that. From our fund's perspective, what we are trying to help them with is, is this going to be sustainable long term? Because we put small amounts of capital. What we don't want is the company to be stuck at the pre-Series A stage, right? So we want to make sure that it becomes they get to a point and they de-risk whatever they're doing, right? No matter what area they're working on, they de-risk it to the point where someone like a Mike or a Dan is going to take a closer look at it. So we are, since we are limited by geography, we are sort of agnostic to the area. But there is a lot of interesting stuff happening. I think in proteomics, in protein degradation, in the microbiome's pretty big as well. In stuff that you didn't mention, and obviously robotic surgery. And then in my brief experience at Johnson & Johnson, I think there's a big thrust on using AI for in a way, like not just throwing that word around, but using in a way that's going to be helpful to reduce costs and talk what Dan alluded to earlier, and then just also digitization of various things when it comes to medical technology and diagnostics.
I'm going to stay with you here for actually my next question. Is the next area I want to talk about with all of you is actually connecting with investors. So, let's assume that I work at a university tech transfer office, or I'm a faculty researcher, I'm an entrepreneur, and I have some type of a biomedical innovation, and I'm thinking about a startup. I think it might be worthwhile for a startup, and I want to begin connecting with investors. What's the best way to do that? What kind of homework should I do? When's the appropriate time to connect with investors and so forth? So I'm going to start with you, Hirak.
I mean, any time is a good time to connect with investors, but I think that most investors would tell you that it would be helpful if you spend some time to kind of research the firm a little bit and kind of find out about what they're investing in. I'm sure Mike and Dan can back me up on this. We get contacted by lots of people where there's no fit. It's like we're investing in Michigan IP only in life sciences, and we'll have like all these messages from people who have, just kind of using some mail merge or something to do that. That's not helpful, obviously. And again, I think from our perspective is if you can articulate why this technology is great and how that's going to, change patient care, and if there's a viable path to a business, that's kind of what investors want to hear. So if you can sort of explain that well, that's, I think, would go a long way. So there's no good or bad time. I think getting to know people early is definitely great, so they can kind of start tracking your progress, even if it's way too early for them.
Mike, what's your perspective on that about how to connect with investors?
Just a couple thoughts. One is somebody out there ought to do this research, because I think the batting average for people who do the broadcast approach to investors is 0. But I don't know that. I don't have the data, but I bet if it got researched, it'd come in pretty close to that. Yeah. And then the other is, the guys that I listen to often are IP attorneys. There's just a handful of them that I know well, and some of the guys who do the corporate attorney stuff, who are often first contacted, especially the IP guys. And I stay in touch with about 5 of them who are probably the best known in the med device space. And when they get something that they think we ought to take a look at, I get a call from them. So, when you're going to begin the intellectual property process of filing your IP, make sure you do it with people who are really ingrained in the sector that you're going to participate in. So that'd be the one key I'd add.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective, Mike. I know that when we're filing patents at Michigan State University in biomed space, we look for firms that really have a very good track record and very knowledgeable in that space. Dan, what's your perspective on the question I was talking about with connecting with investors?
Yeah, I think I heard two questions in there, actually, which I'll give two separate answers to, which is if you're a PI at a university who's got interesting research that you think has commercial potential, then your first stop should be tech transfer and all of the resources that your university has to bring to bear. And I think, something that needs to be acknowledged is that not every technology should have a company built around it, that sometimes a license or another commercial pathway is more appropriate. So going direct to investors is perhaps not the best approach, and talking to tech transfer and some of the entrepreneurs and residents and folks who have experience of sort of what is the right path for this technology and when is the right time. I think, the universities have a lot of resources to bring around that. You started the question by saying if you're sitting in a tech transfer office. So for the tech transfer folks on the phone, I would say if you have technology that you've identified as being, super interesting and you think is, a lot of company potential, please reach out to us and investors. I mean, we have given our location here in Ann Arbor, we do a frequent check-in with the tech transfer team at U of M to make sure that we're staying on top of what's on their hot list of technologies. Our likely answer is going to be, after hearing more about a technology, interesting, let us know when you make more progress, because it's too early for us right now. But it's very important for us to sort of keep our finger on the pulse of what's going on from a research perspective, so that when a technology is ready for a larger round of capital, we're sort of intellectually primed to move on it.
Thanks, Dan. You actually hit on a really interesting point, and it was actually one of the questions that came up in our Q&A is, when should the inventors consider a startup versus a license to an existing company? As a tech transfer person, I have my own little perspective on that, but I'm actually really interested in the investor's perspective here. So I'll open it up to any of you who would like to jump in on that one.
That's a tough one for me to give a blanket answer to, but I think to consider what your investor's business model is and what their expectation would be relative to what you think that technology and company could be. So we're, as venture capital investors, we're stewards of other people's capital, and we're investing it on their behalf to generate a return. And
right.
We want to see a path to making 5 times or more our investment. So if you're going to build a company and you think you need $5 to $10 million to get started, and you might need more after that, you just need to sort of understand how valuable that company needs to ultimately get for all your stakeholders to be happy. But to me, there's sort of there are some single product companies that can be successful. To me, if it's an incremental improvement on a single product, that sounds more like a license. If it's truly disruptive innovation in a certain category, that sounds more like a company.
Yeah, I agree with that perspective, Dan. Mike, did you or Hirak want to weigh in on that, or if not, I can go on to other things.
Well, my only advice would be more on the personal side. If you think you want to tackle a startup, talk to a lot of people who've tried it. The news tends to cover the good stories, and there are a lot of really great entrepreneurs out there who, on their first go around, had a really tough time of it. And if you're trying to maintain, if you're in an academic setting, you're trying to maintain your position there, and you're trying to get a company started, there's probably not enough hours in the day to do both. And you really have to ask yourself if you're ready to jump in full time and take that kind of risk and put in that kind of commitment.
Thanks, Mike. Hirak, I have a question for you. Since in your prior role as you said, you're almost the first money in, or the first investor in a technology. So what was the investment criteria that you used when evaluating life science technologies? What were you looking for at that real early stage where there's probably just something, a nascent innovation in a university laboratory?
The first thing we look at is just understand a little bit about the technology to understand what it, if it works or not. If it's a drug, we want to know what the preclinical data looks like. And kind of the next thing we try to understand is, what's the next milestone, right? Like I said earlier, our goal is to ensure that any capital that we give is going to be super helpful to the company to be more like a business. This is not grant for, developing the technology more. So that's one thing we're trying to figure out, are they just looking for a grant to kind of further the technology, or they're trying to really build a business? And sort of kind of working backwards from the kind of questions the company would get, were they to go for Series A funding, right? Like the things that, Dan and Mike have talked about. So we're trying to evaluate for them what that looks like. And then, most venture capitalists be concerned with the team. We're not that concerned with the team. We are kind of usually okay with the founders being part of it because it's still a little bit early. But we want to also understand sort of their appetite for understanding their limitations, and at some point they would want to step into a different role and bring someone in who's going to actually build the company. So we're evaluating those things as well, because those are not questions relevant right now, but they will be at a point of time. And then we also trying to look forward to, like, is there a market? Is this going to be a real product? And it's going to have that sort of wide range impact as well.
Yeah, I think that's really good perspective, is that you're looking to, if you will, invest in it to make it successful to get to a Series A. So at a Series A point, Dan, I'll turn it over to you. Now, let's assume that a technology has gotten to that Series A. They have some preliminary success, some proof of concept has been made. What are you looking for when you're evaluating a potential opportunity?
I mean, it's some of the things that Hirak just mentioned of what are the next milestones that Series A capital is going to get you to, and then what are the milestones after that will be with the next round, or potentially thinking about exit down the road. I think team, as Hirak mentioned, starts to become much more important, and sort of a question of, is the team in place already that we're investing behind, or are we investing knowing that we're going to have to recruit a management team?
Right.
And we've been talking primarily about medical device today. I think there would be, at least for us, at least some preliminary human clinical data to react to a clear path for what the next studies would be. And then at least some of the foundation around what we think a commercial strategy looks like in terms of getting payment and actually getting onto the market. So by Series A, you're going to be expected to have a fairly complete business plan, and by that I don't mean a 30-page Word document of your business plan, but an outline of how you are going to get from where you are today to on the market and a valuable product that's of interest to customers and strategics and all stakeholders.
Thanks, Dan. Mike, when your company has made an investment, how does your company approach the management team? Do you approach it with the idea of evaluating what they have and then looking to complement that team, or do you prefer to have I'll call it direct control over the leadership and the management team? What's your perspective on that?
We definitely want to back teams that they may need some supplement in a certain specialty area, but we want the team leader there. And it's pretty tough to step into situations where you have to bring somebody in, because and we really hope it's the founder that's the team leader. So we want founder leaders in the companies that we're backing. And if they don't want to do that, and they want to find somebody who is maybe better fit to lead the company and provide the CEO role, that's a different conversation. But yeah, I think we're much more. We'd like it to be somewhat baked before jumping in.
Understood. So thinking about, maybe I'll stay with you if you don't mind, Mike, for a sec. You talked about the fact that in your life, you've invested in a number of technologies and startups out of Big Ten universities. What are common failure modes that you've seen in academic researchers that approach investors? So what are sort of the things for our audience to avoid based on your experience?
Yeah, I think. Whoops. Is that okay? I think the most. It's some form of distrust that just occurs between the founder and the investor, and I think when that kind of enters into the equation, it's a pretty fast downhill slide, and nobody wins in those situations. Often it's driven by it's often driven by not completely understanding what the investor, the way I see it, the founder doesn't completely understand what the investor's role is and how they participate. There are some bad investors who, make that founder's life miserable. But for the most part, Dan said it earlier, investors are, fiduciaries and stewards of other people's capital. And they're looking to make a lot of money on it. And when you come in as kind of a third party and see these situations, everybody's generally trying to get the same thing done. It's just that both sides are not moving forward on a platform of trust. So.
Yeah, I'll echo that. That's actually been the cause of a lot of failures that I've seen from my perch in the tech transfer office. Sometimes watching startups is if there does develop distrust between the team. And I agree with you. I think it's usually because the startup or the entrepreneur, the founder, may not understand what the investor is trying to get at and what the role is. So I think that it is largely communication. Dan or Hirak, any of you want to opine in on another failure mode you've seen and that's common amongst academic entrepreneurs?
I think Mike probably hit on the number one thing. I would say a second is maybe just too much optimism on how much progress can be made on a small amount of capital, and that things just always take longer and cost more than you expect them to. And you need to be an optimist to, as Mike talked about, to go down the startup route and be able to deal with setbacks, but just having a clear-eyed view of capital needs and time and alignment with your investor stakeholders.
Yeah. Hirak, did you want to add something? I thought I saw your mic come open before.
Just a real quick thing is that I think the perception of time for academics is a little bit different from what investors would want. Time is also money. So, trying to make progress very quickly means, it takes enormous amount of effort. So that's one thing that's probably not appreciated by academic founders, that, they're running a full-time lab, they're doing all these classes, plus they're trying to run a company. And I think Mike alluded to earlier is the question is like, do you really want to run a startup as a CEO, right? Like, are you better off being in a role where someone else can do that? Because, it's the, if it takes you 2 years to make the same amount of progress, then you're gonna destroy the IRR. If you could do this in 6 months for someone who's more financially motivated, because you have a duty to your investors as well.
Yeah, actually, you're hitting on a really interesting point. I want to come back at it in just a few minutes about the academic versus an external CEO. We had a question in the Q&A that actually I wanted to tackle, at least an initial answer, and then happy to call on panelists who'd like to add to it. And the question basically says, we talk about the maturity of the product. What would you say is an ideal stage? Sometimes we can't develop a prototype without an investment, and investors will not invest without a prototype, and it's a loop. What are the chances of getting funded if you did good customer discovery and market research, but the product is still in idea phase and need money to start the development? So one piece of advice I would give in that situation is especially for the university folks, is to approach your tech transfer office, because many of us are pretty knowledgeable about the type of resources that exist in what we call gap funds, translational research funds, little pots of money that are really well suited for prototype development. So I'll put in a shameless plug. I run something called the Advance Grant Program in Michigan, and it's for early stage money, specifically for making early stage prototypes. And we award $40,000, $50,000 for these kinds of things. So I would say talk to your tech transfer office, because they're a good source of information on where these little pockets of money may help to get it to that next stage. But any of my panel, Dan, Mike, Hirak, you want to add anything to that?
I think that's great advice. We've funded a couple things that have been truly at idea stage, but there it's been an investment in the people, and it's been entrepreneurs or inventors that we've backed previously. And so they have a certain amount of credibility that we're willing to put capital at risk just in that they were going to drive it to a success. Without that, it is tough, which is why those gap funds and other non-dilutive sources exist.
Right. I'm going to go back to something Hirak was talking before a little bit about what is the appropriate role for the academic founder on the team, being the CEO versus other roles. I know that the advice that I give the research faculty and on my team is that there's probably better roles for them than the CEO. I think that being, I'll call it the lead entrepreneur, especially the early stage function of a startup, I think that's perfectly appropriate. But at some point, I mean, faculty, you have a day job, you're very, very busy, you're running labs, you're writing research grant proposals, and if the startup is going to get off the ground, it needs some people who really have the time to roll up their sleeves. So Mike, you feel any differently about that?
No, and I think it's a fair discussion. If you do have somebody interested in investing, I think it's a fair discussion to have right off the bat. We generally like to have that discussion with the academic founder anyway, and really help them assess if they have the skill set to do it. So, yeah.
Dan, Hirak, either of you have a different perspective on that?
Yeah, just to add to what Mike said, it is a different skill set, not that it cannot be developed, but it has to be acknowledged that this is not something that you've been trained to do for the last 10, 15, 20 years as an academic. Right. And there are certainly, many examples of people who can transition and do that. It's just that it takes enormous effort and determination and willingness to kind of take feedback and advice to learn something that is totally new for you. So it takes some amount of humility as well. Which is tough sometimes. And again, there's just a time and bandwidth issue, right? That, they're doing great stuff. And like I say that, you probably have the best job on the planet, which is like a tenured faculty at Michigan. Why would you want to take the worst job on the planet, which is like a startup CEO, So
That's good. That's a good perspective. We had a question that was directed to Dan, and the question was, what do you look for when evaluating the reimbursement strategy?
I'll answer that, but first, just to add one note on the last comment, I think it's also worth saying that companies have different needs from their CEOs at different times. So there may very well be a period where the founder is the exact right person to be CEO while you're in development phase, and company is still small. There's not a lot of personnel management stuff going on. But, once you get to 40 people and you start generating revenue, there may be a different skill set that's required. And that's not anything against the founder. It's just, the company evolves and so do its needs. In terms of reimbursement strategy, I think a pretty simple answer in that demonstration that you've done your homework and that you have a clear understanding of the pathway to reimbursement, and whether that's, there's an existing reimbursement code and sort of system that we can fit into, and here's the detailed rationale of why our technology is going to fit into that, or it's we're going to need new reimbursement and here are the steps that we need to take, here's the groundwork we need to lay in terms of data, here's the process we're going to go through it in terms of coding and coverage and payment and how long we anticipate all that taking. That, you know, it's a risk with any pre-commercial medical device investment, but as I said, having an understanding upfront and the ability to explain that to investors and being upfront about what risk they're taking on, I think is the most important thing that we look for.
Thanks, Dan. Changing gears a little bit. Now, let's say there's been some courting which has taken place, and you've had some conversations with the founders of the potential startup, and it gets to the point where you're gonna write the first check and you're gonna make an investment. What does the process look like? Maybe you could explain to our audience what they can expect when they're having a conversation and there's an investment about to be made. So, Mike, if you don't mind, I'll start with you on this.
Well, so I'll assume that we've gone through the entire negotiation process, because I think that's where a lot of the kind of unknowns get worked out. Because once you're at the point where, okay, we're ready to write the check, we actually, this is no surprise, don't write a check, right? So
maybe you could explain a little bit the kinds of questions that surface during the negotiation process.
Yeah, so it's so always the first question comes around to valuation, what the founders believe the firm is worth versus what the investors, and that's kind of a dance that, again, I think I've never seen the founders have a lower expectation than the investor. So maybe there are times when that's happened. I've just never been part of it. And I think, you know, early, especially at these earliest phases, you know, the investors' experience, at least, you know, the Hiraks and Dans and Mikes of the world see so many deals in this space that we have a sense of what competitive device or competitive therapeutic deals are going at. So we're not, you know, we're generally not out there bargain hunting. We're generally out there, you know, using market indicators for how to price these things. And, you know, there's a lot of other kind of terms and features built into these financings, but I would just encourage anybody out there to, you know, use the research of the investor, always challenge, you know, valuation. I think there's always room for negotiation, but if you're extremely far apart, you run a real risk of the money walking away. So
right. Yeah, and I think there has to be one piece of advice I would give is there has to be some sense of urgency on both sides. It can't be an academic research project necessarily on when it's time to, when you're having conversations with investors, because the window of opportunity is sometimes limited. Hirak, when you were at that earlier stage of investing, was there any take a little bit different than what Mike was presenting that you guys looked for in terms about what the process looked like, about how your conversation went with the team?
I think we're just trying to set the team up for success, for later success. So, you know, we want to also make sure that, you know, the valuation, I mean, you know, we sometimes don't even value the company is not set at things that is going to be difficult for them. Because I think founders, you know, they come up with some sort of unrealistic expectations, like, yeah, my company's going to be worth 10 million, you know, and you ask them why, and they don't have a good reason. And it just becomes more complicated for them in the next round, because if your valuation is too high in the beginning, then you have to somehow prove to the next round of investors that you kind of, you know, did something that, you know, made it from 10 to 20 or something like that. So, you know, that's something that we work with. But again, you know, we're just trying to focus on some of the fundamentals to get them sort of ready for that next round that, you know, they will be asked for.
Thanks, Hirak. Dan, we're starting to actually get a fair number of questions in, and I think this is great. This is I'd rather focus on them. So Dan, I'm going to turn the first question over to you. It says, is a company investable if it does not generate revenue in 2 years? If yes, generally, how much return the investors would expect if they're investing, say, $1 million for 2 years? So what's your perspective on that? I usually think in terms of longer life timescales, but
I mean, sure, it's investable for someone. It would all depend on the circumstances of, what the company's doing and what the future is. There are companies that get venture funding that are, well, thinking back to our first fund and some of the medical device deals that we did that were, in early stage clinical trials, they were 10 years. We thought it was going to be sooner, but they were 10 years away from generating any revenue or getting on the market. And, there was still a return to be made from those companies. I think different investors have different sort of guideposts for what an acceptable return threshold is. If you just look at the Cambridge Associates data for what constitutes a top quartile performing venture fund, it's roughly 3x gross return would guarantee that you're going to be in the top quartile. So as we look at investments, we have to do sort of a weighted average analysis, recognizing that some of our companies are going to be a 0 and some are going to be successful, but it needs to sort of average out to at least 3x for us to be interested.
Yeah, one thing that I'll add too is the time horizon varies a lot by what is it? What is the innovation? So in digital health, you can sometimes expect things a little bit earlier, but on the other hand, you're developing something that's going to require FDA approval and regulatory approvals. Obviously, those are longer time scales.
I mean, maybe just 2 points of context to add for people of what it's like to work in a venture fund like ours. I mean, we're seeing 500 or so deals a year, and we're making 2 or 3 investments. So we're saying no to 99.5% of things that come in. And of those investments that we're making, our expectation is that we'll have a liquidity event, whether that's the company is acquired or goes public or whatever the case may be, in a time span of 4 to 7 years. So I don't know that that's not necessarily going to be the case for seed stage investors, but that's how we look at it as a early stage VC fund.
Yeah, I think it's good perspective. We had a question here directed back, Mike, at something that you had said. And the question is, how is the worth generally determined? I think what they mean is value. How does that relate to the market size and expected revenue? For a new entrepreneur, how should one determine the company's value or the worth? I think it's a good question.
Yeah, so a lot of it has to do with comparables of what's going on in the space. And the reason we use comparables is that there's a number of deals cooking at any one time. And if one gets overpriced too early, I think you heard Hirak talk about pricing an early round too high, can have a real negative effect on next rounds and whether you get capital or not. And so there's no real science to it. I think it's much more of I think I called it a dance earlier. It's utilizing market information that the investor is coming up with, utilizing expectations of the founders and trying to come to an agreement of, where in the middle of that you can get, the number to work. And Dan said it. I mean, if the models that the venture people put together can't show, Dan was kind at 5x. I think it's more like 10x, that if you can't get to a 10x return in 7 years based off of a model that likely was generated by the CEO or the founder, but was given a haircut by the investor, if that model doesn't show a way for the investor to get that kind of return, given that valuation, you probably aren't going to get the deal. So,
right. I have a couple other points I want to touch on, but then I also want to let each of our panelists talk about reflecting on their favorite or least favorite investments in a university startup. So that could be fun. But before I do that, I'm interested in what you feel are some common misconceptions about working with investors. Hirak, I'm going to start with you on that, if you don't mind. What do you think are some of the common misconceptions about working with investors?
I guess the most common one, and this is probably someone who's sort of naive about what this is. I think they perceive the situation as like, I need money, you have money, so this is going to work, right? So, that's kind of a biggest common misperception. And I think what Mike and Dan said is, you're stewards of, I'm stewards of the university's capital. They are stewards of somebody else's capital. So I think it's important for them, for faculty who are new to, or anyone who's raising capital first time, to understand like, where's the investor coming from, right? Like, and they mentioned very clearly what the hurdle rate for them is, the timing, all that stuff, right? So when you put that in perspective, then it sort of helps you realize how realistic your plan is. And that's one. And the second thing is, maybe you have a better idea. You don't have to persist with whatever idea you have now. It can pivot to something else. And oftentimes, second time founders are more successful, than first time founders, right? Because you kind of make all the mistakes and you learn from that.
Yeah. Dan, what are your misconceptions that you see?
I think Hirak hit it quite well. And I think just one other is that there's a perception that venture capitalists want to come in and take over your company and run it. We have no interest in doing that. We have lots of investments to manage, and we're relying on our management teams to run the company. Now, certainly we will play an active hand through the board and advising on strategy. And, if changes of management are needed, we step in and play a role with that. But that's maybe a distinction between private equity and venture, is that our business model is much less about having a team of operating executives who are pulling in and taking over a company. It's more that we're investing and trying to partner with the management team to turn a company into a success.
Thanks, Dan. We have a very limited time left. So I'm going to ask each one of you to keep the next your answer to like roughly a minute, but real quick, favorite in a good way or bad way of investments on an academic startup. Mike, we'll start with you.
We spun a company out of the Kresge Eye Institute back in the 90s. It was called Intralays. And we had a great founder who's still continuing to be an entrepreneur. We had an early stage CEO that took the company to a certain phase. We brought in a commercialization team, and that company was able to go public and get acquired a year after that. And was one of the greatest, I think one of the great University of Michigan tech transfer stories that's out there. So it was fun to watch. Did you ask for a worst one too?
Well, either or. I'll go to Hirak.
Intralays, that's my favorite.
Thank you, Hirak. How about you?
My favorite story is probably Parabricks. It's the only exit that we've had so far. Why I like the story is that these were a couple of graduate students who had just decided to kind of form a company and not go work at Amazon or something. And they really needed our capital, and they were first-time founders, and we were really glad that we were able to help them, get to a point where they made progress, and then NVIDIA bought them. So in terms of our mission, that's kind of a great story because we're not necessarily looking for 10x or 5x return, but we're trying to see how can we get these companies to the next stage. And obviously, we've got other examples in our portfolio that are doing well. But this was an example of, say, first-time founders and many of the people in the audience that it's possible, right? Like with the right amount of capital and the right amount of steps, you can make good progress and have a good ending.
Thanks, Hirak. And Dan, we'll give you the last word on this.
Yeah, I'll point to an investment that was made at Arboretum prior to my joining, which was a company called Handy Lab, which was a University of Michigan technology. And I like it for two reasons. One, that the ultimate acquisition of Handy Lab was not based on the original technology that started out as a lab on a chip, sort of very small diagnostic device. They ended up pivoting that to a automated instrument that sat on a benchtop, recognizing that the commercial opportunity was much better, and it turned into a very successful acquisition by a diagnostic company. And then second is that's just been a great local story of entrepreneurs and executives who have been recycled into other companies. So Callie and Handik went on to found Celsi, which has now been a successful exit. Sundew, we backed in Pneumatics Molecular, which was also a successful exit. So just a great example of sort of success leading to more success.
Yeah, I remember that example well, Dan. The acquisition by the medical company was happened while I was still working at U of M, and it was there was a lot of celebration in the tech transfer office over that one. So I think we're about out of time. I want to thank Mike, Hirak, Dan. I want to thank all of you for your insights and being generous with your time today. And if there's, I'm going to ask Brad or Sam or John if there's any last minute words or instructions for our audience right now. Yeah, so looks like we have a link up to the virtual poster session. So please feel free to click on that. And thanks again for everyone for participating in this webinar, and appreciate everyone's expertise. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rich. Yes, that's exactly right. So attendees, in the chat feature, you'll see a link that will take you to that virtual poster session. There will also be a schedule on that same homepage of which our special guests will be in different rooms having conversations with the poster presenters. So please feel free to bounce from room to room or stay for a discussion at one particular poster and join in when the time is right. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon.